Imagine waking up tomorrow to a headline that reads, "Canada closes its border to American cars." Sounds dramatic, right? But if that ever happened, the US auto industry would collapse almost overnight. Billions of dollars in sales would vanish, factories would grind to a halt, and some of America's most iconic brands could be pushed to the edge of survival. That's how critical Canada is to the American auto industry. It isn't just a neighbor buying a few cars, it's the backbone of US exports, the hidden lifeline that keeps Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, and even Tesla from losing their grip on the market. Canada isn't just another customer. It's the single biggest destination for US-made vehicles, and for decades it's been absorbing millions of cars and trucks that roll off American assembly lines. Without Canadian buyers, America's best sellers, the Ford F-Series, the Chevy Silverado, the Ram 1500, wouldn't be the legends they are today. And it's not only about sales. The two countries share one of the most tightly integrated automotive supply chains in the world. A single part might cross the US-Canada border half a dozen times before it becomes part of a finished car. That's how interconnected these industries are. Ford leans heavily on Canada, not just for demand but also for production. Models like the Edge were built in Ontario for years, while the F-Series dominates Canadian roads much like it does in America. GM has deep roots too, with parts plants in Ontario that keep its US factories moving. Stellantis depends on Canadian Jeep buyers to maintain its relevance in the SUV market, while Ram pickups fight tooth and nail with Ford and Chevy in Canadian showrooms. And Tesla? It thrives in Canada's growing EV sector, where its reputation has made it the go-to electric brand for many buyers north of the border. What makes Canada so important is its consistency. While US consumer demand swings with interest rates, gas prices, and economic uncertainty, Canadian buyers provide a steady cushion that keeps American automakers stable. When the US market cools, Canada picks up the slack. And thanks to trade agreements like USMCA, the auto industry in North America isn't really divided into separate countries, it's one giant ecosystem. Breaking that link would make American automakers far less competitive against global giants like Toyota, Volkswagen, or China's rapidly rising BYD. But here's the kicker: this partnership isn't just about money, it's about survival. As the US industry faces pressure from electrification, shifting consumer demands, and global competition, Canada fills in the gaps. From raw materials for EV batteries, to skilled labor, to loyal truck buyers, Canada is woven into the very fabric of the US auto industry. Without it, Ford's EV ambitions, GM's Ultium battery program, and Stellantis' hybrid push would all be on shaky ground. Ford would be the first name on the chopping block if the Canadian market suddenly disappeared. The F-Series isn't just America's best-selling vehicle, it's also Canada's favorite truck. For decades, Canadian buyers have kept Ford at the top of the sales charts, and that consistency has given Ford the financial backbone to experiment with new technology, like the F-150 Lightning. Without those Canadian sales, Ford's truck dominance would take a major hit, and the ripple effect would be brutal. Less revenue from trucks means fewer resources for EV development, fewer investments in plants, and even potential layoffs. And remember, Ford doesn't just sell trucks in Canada, it also sells SUVs like the Explorer and Expedition, which have carved out loyal followings north of the border. Losing that base would shake the company's stability in ways many Americans don't even realize. General Motors is another giant that leans heavily on Canadian demand. The Chevrolet Silverado and GMC Sierra are locked in a constant battle with Ford for pickup supremacy, and Canadian buyers are central to that fight. GM's crossovers, like the Chevrolet Equinox and GMC Terrain, are also popular with Canadian families, and those steady sales give GM the breathing room it needs to fund its electric pivot. And here's the hidden part: GM has major parts and production facilities in Ontario, which means Canadian labor is literally building the vehicles that drive GM's profits. Cut off Canada, and GM loses not just buyers, but a critical supply chain partner that keeps its US operations humming. Then there's Stellantis, which may actually have the most to lose. Jeep has always been a brand with global appeal, and Canada is no exception. Canadians love their Wranglers, Cherokees, and Grand Cherokees for navigating harsh winters and outdoor adventures. And Ram trucks, they're locked in the same high-stakes battle, Ford and GM, fighting for dominance in Canada's truck-loving market. For Stellantis, every Canadian sale matters because the company is already under enormous pressure in the US, where competition is fierce and profits are razor-thin. Without the Canadian cushion, Stellantis could find itself falling behind even faster, especially as it tries to shift resources into hybrids and EVs. Tesla's relationship with Canada might look smaller on paper, but it's more important than many realize. Canada's EV adoption rate is climbing quickly, helped by government incentives and a strong appetite for clean technology. Tesla has leveraged this to build one of its most loyal customer bases outside the United States. Every Model 3, Model Y, or Model S sold in Canada helps Tesla defend its lead against rising rivals like Hyundai, Kia, Volkswagen, and soon, Chinese EV brands pushing aggressively into global markets. Without Canadian demand, Tesla would lose not just sales, but also a key testing ground for cold weather EV performance, something Canadian owners provide through real-world feedback that helps the company refine its vehicles for global markets. The truth is, every one of these automakers, Ford, GM, Stellantis, and Tesla, depends on Canada not just for numbers, but for balance. The US market is massive but volatile. Canada provides stability, scale, and synergy, turning what could be a fragmented system into a cohesive North American auto industry. And that interdependence has roots going back decades to the 1965 Auto Pact, which laid the foundation for the cross-border integration we see today. Cars and parts crisscross the border multiple times before they're finished, and the sales flow right along with them. That's why, when you look under the surface, Canada isn't a secondary market, it's a lifeline that US automakers can't afford to lose. And this is where the conversation shifts from just cars and trucks to the future of the entire industry. Electric vehicles. The US has ambitious plans to electrify its fleet, but here's the uncomfortable truth. America doesn't have enough of the raw materials it needs to make it happen on its own. That's where Canada steps in. Canada is rich in lithium, nickel, cobalt, and other critical minerals that are essential for EV batteries. Without access to those resources, Ford's F-150 Lightning, GM's Ultium platform, and even Tesla's long-term growth strategy would all be in jeopardy. Canada isn't just a beer of EVs, it's becoming one of the most important suppliers in the world for the materials that will decide who wins the EV race. GM has already recognized this, signing deals with Canadian suppliers to secure nickel and cobalt for its Ultium battery plants. Ford has been exploring similar agreements, and even Stellantis, which has been slower to move into electrification, is investing in Canadian partnerships to secure its future battery needs. Tesla, too, has turned to Canada for lithium and nickel contracts to stabilize its supply chain. This is no small detail. Battery materials are the new oil, and Canada is positioning itself as the Middle East of EV resources. For American automakers, keeping those ties strong isn't optional, it's survival, but Canada's role goes beyond just digging minerals out of the ground. The country is rapidly building up its EV manufacturing ecosystem. Plants in Ontario are being retooled to produce electric vehicles, and battery factories are being planned with the support of both Canadian and American investments. For example, Stellantis and LG Energy are building a massive battery plant in Windsor, Ontario, right across the river from Detroit. That location wasn't chosen by accident. It ensures parts and batteries can flow directly into the US auto heartland without international shipping bottlenecks. This kind of integration makes the US and Canada almost inseparable when it comes to electrification. And let's not forget the Canadian consumer side of the EV story. With strong government incentives, higher fuel prices, and growing environmental awareness, Canadians are often quicker to adopt EVs than their American neighbors. This makes Canada a kind of testing ground for US automakers. They can roll out new EVs north of the border, study adoption trends, and then use those lessons to strengthen their US strategies. In that way, Canadian buyers aren't just customers, they're partners in shaping the future of the American auto industry. All of this paints a bigger picture. The US auto industry isn't just connected to Canada, it's dependent on it in ways that most people don't see. Trucks, SUVs, EVs, batteries, raw materials. Canada is woven into every step of the process. That's why American automakers lobby so hard to protect trade agreements like USMCA and to ensure cross-border flows stay smooth. Without Canada, the US wouldn't just lose a market, it would lose a strategic partner in the fight to remain competitive on the global automotive stage. And as we move deeper into the 2020s, with China pushing aggressively into EV dominance, and Europe setting stricter environmental standards, the US will lean on Canada even more. Canadian resources, Canadian factories, Canadian buyers, all of it combines to give US automakers the scale they need to fight these global battles. Without Canada, Ford, GM, Stellantis, and Tesla would be forced to face international competition, with one arm tied behind their back. Exactly. Because when you zoom out and look at the global stage, the Canadian partnership isn't just a nice-to-have for US automakers, it's their shield against the fiercest competition they've ever faced. China's BYD, for example, is pumping out EVs at record speed, with prices so low that American automakers can't compete without strong regional alliances. BYD has already overtaken Tesla as the world's largest EV maker, and if US automakers were left to fight them alone, without the Canadian market bolstering sales and resources, the outcome could be devastating. Canada helps US companies scale up production, keep prices more competitive, and strengthen supply chains so they don't collapse under global pressure. Europe adds another layer to the challenge. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, and even newcomers like Polestar are aggressively targeting North America with EVs that are refined, efficient, and increasingly affordable. Without Canada, the US would lose not just sales, but a strategic buffer against European automakers who already dominate luxury segments. Think about Cadillac and Lincoln, two American luxury brands already struggling against their German rivals. Canadian buyers who often seek American luxury vehicles as an alternative to European imports are keeping those brands alive. Without them, the gap between American and European automakers in the luxury space would only widen. And here's the hidden pressure point. Canada gives US automakers geographic security. Competing with China means dealing with supply chains that stretch across the globe, vulnerable to political tensions, tariffs, and shipping bottlenecks. But with Canada, everything is right next door. Batteries, parts, even full EVs can move seamlessly across the border. This proximity is a massive advantage in a world where supply chain disruptions are becoming more common. It keeps costs down, production steady, and sales flowing, even when global chaos threatens to upend the industry. Ford, GM, Stellantis, and Tesla all know that without this integrated North American system, they'd be swallowed alive by international rivals. That's why they're pouring billions into cross-border projects, battery plants in Windsor, vehicle assembly lines in Ontario, and mineral contracts that tie Canadian resources directly to American factories. These aren't short-term moves. They're long-term survival strategies built on the assumption that Canada will remain an uncheckable partner. But let's not forget the consumer side again, because Canadian buyers play a role in shaping how US automakers stand up to global competition too. When Canadians choose a Ford Lightning over a BYD import, or a Chevy Blazer EV over a Volkswagen ID.4, they aren't just buying a vehicle, they're voting with their wallets to keep the North American auto industry strong. And that consumer loyalty gives US automakers the confidence to invest in innovation, knowing that their northern neighbor will support them. The stakes are only going to get higher from here. As EV adoption accelerates globally, the lines between regional markets are blurring. Chinese and European automakers want in on North America, and without Canada, US automakers would lose half their shield against this tidal wave of competition. That's why the Canadian market isn't just important, it's existential. And as we look ahead, one question becomes clear. How long can US automakers rely on this partnership? And what happens if Canadian loyalty begins to shift toward foreign brands offering cheaper or more advanced EVs? That risk is very real, because Canadian consumers have shown time and time again that they aren't blindly loyal, they'll follow the best value. If Toyota, Hyundai, or even BYD starts offering EVs with longer range and cheaper price tags, Canadian buyers could easily pivot away from Detroit's offerings, and that's where the danger lies. Ford, GM, Stellantis, and Tesla can't just assume Canada will stay loyal forever. They have to constantly prove their worth with competitive pricing, strong dealer networks, and vehicles that actually meet the needs of Canadian drivers dealing with harsh winters, high fuel costs, and unique driving conditions. Take Hyundai and Kia, For example, in recent years, they've surged in Canadian sales thanks to stylish, affordable SUVs and EVs that offer good range at reasonable prices. If Ford or GM slip up in the EV rollout, these Korean brands are poised to capture even more of that market share. Then there's Toyota, which dominates the hybrid segment in Canada. While US automakers have been slow to embrace hybrids, Toyota has built decades of trust among Canadians looking for fuel-efficient cars. That trust could quickly expand into EV dominance if American automakers don't accelerate their strategies. The looming wildcard, though, is China. BYD and other Chinese automakers haven't yet entered the Canadian market in force, but if they do and if they bring their ultra-affordable EVs, American automakers could lose their northern advantage almost overnight. BYD's vehicles already undercut Tesla in other parts of the world, and with Canada's appetite for affordable EVs growing, the entry of a Chinese brand could change the entire balance of power in North America. If Canadian buyers begin choosing BYD or another foreign brand over Ford or GM, the US industry would not only lose sales, it would lose the very buffer that helps it withstand global competition. That's why Detroit is working overtime to prevent this shift. Automakers are investing in Canadian plants to show commitment, lobbying for government EV incentives that favor North American vehicles, and pushing the narrative that buying American or North American isn't just about a car, it's about supporting jobs and industries across both borders. Ford, for instance, has emphasized the Made in North America story with its EVs, while GM has tied its Ultium battery investments directly into Canadian communities. Tesla, meanwhile, leverages its tech leadership and cold weather performance testing to appeal to Canadians looking for cutting-edge EVs that can handle harsh conditions. But the truth is, consumer loyalty is fragile. Incentives shift, fuel prices rise, new models arrive, and buyers follow the trends. American automakers can't take Canada for granted. They need to innovate faster, keep prices competitive, and strengthen the North American story if they want to keep Canadians on their side, because once loyalty is lost, it's nearly impossible to win back, especially when global players are circling with attractive alternatives. And this raises a bigger question as the automotive world shifts toward EV dominance. Can US automakers keep Canada not just as a market, but as an alliance shaping the future of North American transportation? Absolutely, because Canadian policy is now one of the most powerful forces shaping the decisions of American automakers. Canada has committed to phasing out new gas-powered vehicle sales by 2035, aligning with Europe's timeline and putting pressure on the US, where regulations are far more fragmented. For Ford, GM, Stellantis, and Tesla, this means they can't just rely on selling traditional trucks and SUVs in Canada forever. They need to meet Canada's aggressive EV targets or risk losing access to one of their most reliable markets. And since Canada often acts as a regulatory testing ground, whatever automakers learn north of the border inevitably influences their strategies in the US. EV incentives are another major driver. Canadian buyers often receive federal rebates of up to $5,000 for electric vehicles, and many provinces add their own incentives on top. Quebec, for example, offers some of the most generous subsidies in North America, making it a hotbed for EV adoption. Tesla has leveraged this to maintain strong sales of the Model 3 and Model Y, while Ford's Mustang Mach-E and F-150 Lightning have also benefited from these programs. But here's the catch: only vehicles that meet specific price caps and regional assembly rules qualify. That means American automakers are under constant pressure to keep their EVs affordable and compliant, or they risk being left out of the incentive pool that drives consumer demand. Canadian environmental policies also push automakers to clean up their supply chains. With stricter emission standards and a growing emphasis on sustainability, US automakers have had to rethink how they produce and transport vehicles. For instance, GM's Canadian operations are increasingly tied to renewable energy initiatives, while Ford and Stellantis are investing in Canadian battery plants designed to reduce the carbon footprint of their EV production. These moves aren't just about Canada, they're about setting up infrastructure that can serve the entire North American market in a more sustainable way. And then there's the government partnerships. Both Ottawa and provincial governments have been offering massive subsidies to attract US automakers into building EV infrastructure Canadian soil. Stellantis and LG's battery plant in Windsor received billions in government support, and Volkswagen recently announced plans for a huge Canadian gigafactory with similar backing. These investments don't just create jobs in Canada, they directly benefit the US auto industry by ensuring that supply chains remain regional, secure, and less vulnerable to overseas shocks. It's no coincidence that these factories are being built within hours of Detroit. They're part of a strategic effort to anchor North America's future. What's fascinating is how all of this makes Canada not just a consumer market, but a policy leader. When Canadian regulators set stricter emissions limits, American automakers can't ignore them because the Canadian market is too important to lose. In many ways, Canada is pulling Detroit into the future faster than US policies alone ever could. And this creates a dynamic where the US auto industry isn't just selling to Canada, it's being shaped by it, which leads to a critical realization. If Canada is setting the pace on electrification, emissions, and incentives, then US automakers aren't just relying on Canada for sales and resources, they're relying on Canada to define the rules of the next era of the auto industry. We're already seeing those changes play out in the kinds of vehicles US automakers are building for the Canadian market and, by extension, the US market too. Trucks and SUVs may dominate today, but the pressure from Canadian regulations and consumer preferences is forcing Detroit to rethink what those vehicles will look like in the future.